All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. My name is Mary Margaret Zindran. I am the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the AIA Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Northern Minnesota chapters. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the outcomes of a multi-year research effort that's focused on culture change in the profession of architecture. And as I walk through my presentation, I'm actually going to shut down my video so I'm able better to see and you're able to focus. We'll walk through the whole presentation and then have ample time at the end for Q&A. I encourage you to put comments and questions in the chat as you have them. And Amanda will be working with me to identify some questions that arose during the session to take at the end of the session. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be sharing with you is the outcomes of our culture change initiative. It involved 2 years of work analyzing the profession of architecture. And while our research was conducted in the context of Minnesota's architecture community, I really do think that you will find it relevant to your work at AIA California and in your firms and in local schools of architecture. So the goals of the Culture Change Initiative have been to examine the current culture of the profession of architecture, to define the desired culture, what we're aiming for, and to figure out what it will take to accelerate progress from our current state to that desired state. The core planning and research team that has worked on this initiative and brought it to this point includes Paviel French and myself from the AIA Minnesota staff team, a leadership team of our members, Emily Kopp, Anna Pravinata, and Elizabeth Turner, and some additional key contributors, Sarah Dew, Nick Hoffman, and Alejandra Cervantes Enriquez. The Culture Change Initiative was prompted by the rise of the Me Too movement back in spring of 2018. That New York Times investigation of accusations made against Richard Meyer and the wide circulation of the list that brought forward additional accusations anonymously, which of course was pulled down due to liability concerns. AIA National's response at the time to those events was primarily twofold. They revised the AIA Code of Ethics to include stronger language discouraging harassment, discrimination, and bullying behavior. And they adopted and required AIA chapters and components like ours to adopt harassment and discrimination policies. Our AIA Minnesota staff and board of directors believed that our response needed to go further than that. We recognize that many companies and industries have had ethical guidance and policies like these in place for decades without having significant effect. We needed to go beyond dealing with the symptoms and get to the deeply rooted issues in the culture of architecture, recognizing that it was a culture that allowed such behavior, these open secrets in Meyer's firm and in the profession broadly, to be tolerated. This perspective of our staff and board was informed by work in California, the AIA San Francisco chapter's findings from its Equity by Design initiative, and by our own research in Minnesota between 2014 and 2018. Our Women in Architecture Committee's research making the business case for growing the number of women in number and in influence in the profession, our diversity task force research and recommendations, and even our strategic planning research with our membership, students, and industry partners in our region. So for the Culture Change Initiative, we took on both primary and secondary research. Our original primary research involved assembling more than 70 members of AIA Minnesota as the Culture Change Resource Team. They met in multi-hour sessions, including in-depth small group work 4 times over the course of 2019, and twice to review and refine the outcomes of this work. That group was demographically diverse, with the intent of reflecting the demographics of the population of Minnesota, and thereby overrepresenting the number of women and people of color in the profession. It was also diverse in age and in positional power, from people who were very new to the profession in entry-level positions, through to individuals who were recently retired and had been CEOs of architecture firms. And in the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, meetings were held with Black architects and designers of our local community, many of whom had already been involved in our Culture Change Resource Team in order to gain additional and more in-depth insights. Our secondary research sources included the AIA Guides for Equitable Practice, which were the basis for the initial questions asked of the Culture Change Resource Team. Media interviews and columns written by people who are underrepresented in architecture also informed this work of examining the current culture and defining the desired culture. To determine what would best move the culture from current state to desired state, we turned to systems theory, complexity theory, adaptive leadership theory, and intercultural development theory. Today, I'm going to share these outcomes of our research and analysis. Why culture change is possible now, the catalyzing forces and business case for change. How the desired culture involves aiming for AEC, a culture that is authentic, equitable, and collaborative. Insights from systems thinking and leverage points analysis that can accelerate our ability to create the change we seek. The fact that culture change is the work of cultivation, creating the conditions for change. And that this is everyone's work. No matter your demographics, no matter your position, you can create culture change. The first finding is that culture change is possible now. Systems theory tells us that destabilization of a system makes it more susceptible and more amenable to change. Over the past few years, there have been 4 profoundly destabilizing forces building upon each other to make now the right time to lead change in the culture of the architecture profession. The Me Too movement, which has led firm leaders and clients to do more to identify and address barriers that hinder the success of women in their careers. The nation's current reckoning with systemic racism, bringing to the fore concerns about the practices, structures, and culture of the profession that make it difficult to attract and retain people of color in architecture and get in the way of creating equitable and just design solutions. The rise of climate change as a societal and client priority and as a top priority of AIA National, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which forced the profession to adopt remote work approaches and flexible hours, and to recognize the challenges faced by caregivers. The fact that the entire profession made a shift to remote work almost overnight and has sustained this way of working for more than a year has created unprecedented opportunity to reshape our thinking around where, when, and how we work as the pandemic continues and eventually wanes. The convergence of these major destabilizing forces creates a once-in-a-generation opportunity for systems change, for culture change. It's important to note that these destabilizing forces are in fact overlapping and intersectional in nature. And these forces affect both the profession and the built environment. The pandemic, of course, has had deeper impacts on women, who tend to still carry significantly more of the caregiving burden than men. People of color are more susceptible to severe health impacts from the pandemic due to health issues tied to systemic racism in healthcare and as related to generational poverty. Climate change is a contributor to both the creation and the dispersion of novel coronaviruses like COVID-19 and has disproportionate impacts on people of color who, through discriminatory housing and planning practices, are more likely to live in areas with less green space, higher temperatures, and more air pollution. While this culture change initiative is focused on the profession of architecture, it's clear that these same destabilizing forces are already changing the desires of clients and the design solutions that will best protect the public health, safety, and welfare going forward. With this in mind, the firms that are best positioned for success in the years ahead are firms whose demographics reflect those of the broader population, firms that have strong ongoing partnerships with women-owned and Black, Indigenous, and POC-owned firms, and firms where individuals throughout the firm have strong collaboration skills and the ability to both recognize and bridge across to adapt toward difference, what is called intercultural competence. Here we're talking about not just internal demographic differences, but being able to work successfully with industry teams, with clients, and with users who are, and has been confirmed by the most recent census, will be ever more demographically diverse. The diversity, inclusion, and intercultural competence of the team will be key to winning work, public, nonprofit, and private sector work, and being able to complete that work to the satisfaction of clients and users. Firms positioned for success are also those that have made flexible, outcomes-based approaches core to their way of working and have established a solid base of skill and knowledge in developing, implementing, and measuring design solutions that are climate-oriented and equitable. The number of firms that can say, with integrity, that they are currently well-positioned in these ways is much fewer than it needs to be for the profession to succeed in the years to come. Coming at all this from another angle, a 2019 Harvard Business Review article pointed to research showing the business benefits of creating a culture of belonging, a concept that is as important to your work within your firms as it is to the architectural solutions you create for your clients. High belonging was linked to a 56% increase in job performance, a 50% drop in turnover risk, and a 75% reduction in sick days. Employees with higher workplace belonging also showed a 167% increase in their willingness to recommend their company to others. They also received double the raises and 18 times more promotions. The authors of this article conducted an additional study focused on whether there is also a cost to exclusion. They found that feeling excluded causes employees to give less effort to the work of the team that is excluding them. Overall, there is a true business imperative for the culture of the profession and AEC firms generally to change. Culture change is needed to support firms' ability to survive and thrive. In determining the culture we need to create in the profession of architecture, our staff and core team members recognize these business imperatives. We also went through all of the notes from the multiple multi-hour conversations with the Culture Change Resource Team, the additional interviews and media articles and columns, and mapped these against the AIA Guides for Equitable Practice. We grouped and narrowed and landed upon these three core elements of the desired culture: authentic, equitable, and collaborative. When we're talking about an authentic culture, It's one where a person can be open in sharing their thoughts and perspectives, where the lives people live, the many aspects of who they are comfortably shared and are valued. Authentic culture is one based on trust that is from the beginning of the relationship, rather than required to be proven and earned over time. An authentic culture is one of candor based on trust and mutual respect, where various and opposing views can be expressed and heard, and where they have the potential to shape the outcome. And an authentic culture is one where you can be yourself, where your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, your ethnicity, and other important aspects of who you are don't have to be concealed in order for you to be seen as a valuable member of the team. Just a side note here, in Minnesota, working to create an authentic culture within the profession of architecture is particularly challenging because Minnesota culture tends to avoid conflict, and openly disagreeing is considered by many to be rude. To make headway in creating a culture of authenticity in the face of headwinds from Minnesota culture more broadly requires us to focus first on trust and respect. You may find that there are particular aspects of the culture where your offices are located that create their own advantages or challenges related to creating a firm and component culture that's rooted in authenticity. When we talk about an equitable culture, it's one where we move beyond focusing on what we all have in common, our shared humanity, our shared desire to create great outcomes in the built environment, and we recognize where there are differences among us. Focusing on equal distribution of resources and treating everyone the same often ignores important differences in how the broader world and the profession have historically treated people who have been underrepresented or marginalized. Equitable cultures focus on fair outcomes. They recognize where the system of architecture provides inherent advantages to some individuals more than others and offers ways to bridge those gaps. Equitable cultures recognize where there are aspects of the culture that accelerate the career growth of some individuals and hinder the career growth of others. As one example, the sport of golf as a networking and mentoring activity takes a lot of time and money to get good at, and it's one where women and people of color were long excluded. The amount of time it takes to practice and to play makes it less conducive for people who are caregivers to participate in. Equitable cultures adopt beliefs and frame challenges in a way that recognizes disparities as more systemic in nature than about the individual. And leaders within equitable cultures are those who are able to adapt toward the differences of others, as opposed to assuming or insisting that others adapt toward their traditions or ways that are comfortable for them. We're also aiming for a collaborative culture. One of the most interesting findings from our research was that many people take pride in the collaborative nature of architecture, that this is seen as a characteristic of the current culture of the profession. Yet at the same time, many others in the profession did not see the culture as collaborative and pointed to the many ways it is individualistic in nature. The difference here was particularly pronounced among women and people of color. While the stated intentions, the assumptions, are that the work of architecture is collaborative, the actual experience of women and people of color was that the work did not feel collaborative. When we looked back to the strategic planning research that we did at AIA Minnesota in 2016, we saw the same issues related to the broader AEC industry. Architects viewed themselves as collaborative and want to be seen as collaborators. But people in interior design, engineering, construction, and the trades did not see architects as collaborative and wished for a more collaborative spirit industry-wide. We're talking here about how there is currently a difference between intent and impact. In the desired culture, the intentions of collaboration are matched by how collaborative the process actually feels for all involved. In a collaborative culture, teamwork is prioritized over individual achievement. This is reflected in things like criteria for performance evaluations and in how project outcomes are assessed. Collaborative cultures foster mutual respect, no matter one's age, experience, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, abilities, or disabilities. A collaborative culture involves listening to understand and responding based on what is learned. Listening to understand is different than active listening, which is a particular practice of reflecting back to someone what was heard and confirming what is understood. Active listening can come across as inauthentic and distancing. Listening to understand is less performative and is about being authentically present. It also requires a comfort with not knowing, an assumption that as the listener, you have much to learn from others, as opposed to holding tightly to the idea of architect as expert. And finally, collaborative cultures recognize there is no one right way, that there are almost always multiple ways of interpreting information, executing a process, and getting to a desired outcome. For those who feel that it is daunting to try to create a culture of architecture that is authentic, equitable, and collaborative in these ways, it's critical to realize that culture is built every day by every one of us through the actions we take, the conversations we have, the questions we ask, and the choices we make. Every one of us, every day. This recognition led us to look more specifically at the system of the profession and those everyday actions and decisions. We recognized that the profession of architecture is a dynamic, adaptive human system to which systems theory, systems thinking could be applied in determining how it currently operates and how we can best and most quickly move from the current state of the culture to the desired state. As a reminder, systems thinking is about viewing the elements of a system in a holistic, expansive way, focused on the interconnectedness and relationships among elements of the system, rather than on the individual parts. Recognizing that dynamic, adaptive systems don't operate in a linear fashion or in silos. Each element influences the other in ways that are ever emergent. What's courageous about systems thinking is that it leads you to ask questions that are impolitic, that can feel uncomfortable. It leads you to solutions that may be counterintuitive and challenge foundational assumptions and beliefs. A systems thinking intervention is particularly useful when you're dealing with an issue that's important, a problem that's chronic and familiar, and a problem that people have tried to solve but have yet to be successful in addressing. The problems related to the culture of the profession certainly seem to meet this definition. So in identifying ways to intervene in the system, we turn to leverage points analysis, the approach developed by Donella Meadows decades ago that remains core to systems theory. Meadows identified 12 leverage points, 12 places to intervene in a system, each with varying levels of ability to move the system. The 12th and least impactful is the leverage point of constants, parameters, and numbers, the stocks flowing into a system. In the case of the profession of architecture, this would be the numbers of individuals of various demographics entering the profession. The 11th is buffers and stabilizers, the elements of the system that counter and diffuse the impact of efforts focused on the flow of stocks into the system. 10th, how the system is structured. 9th, delays between when an action is taken in the system and the impact of that action. 8th, balancing feedback loops, those that work to keep the system at its existing equilibrium. 7th, reinforcing feedback loops, those that encourage actions to build upon each other to create a particular outcome. 6th, The flow of information. Who has access to what information at what times in what sequence? Fifth, rules. What is rewarded and what is discouraged? Both the rules that are stated and those that go unsaid and are inherently understood by those who are successful or dominant in the culture. Fourth, who has the power to change what elements of the system? The power to experiment, to self-organize, to make determinations in the moment. Third, the stated and unstated goals of the system. Second, mindsets and paradigms, the beliefs, biases, and assumptions from which the other aspects of the system flow. Mindsets are the basis for everything from structure to information flows to rules and goals. And first, the ability to transcend paradigms, to look entirely beyond the existing system and its mindsets to new ways of thinking and being. The interventions that focus on the leverage points closest to the fulcrum in this graphic are those where it takes a lot of force and focus to impact systems change, while those farthest away, most distant from the fulcrum, are where small changes can have significant impact on the system. As part of our Culture Change Initiative research, we conducted a leverage points analysis of the system of the profession through the lens of culture change. While not an exhaustive analysis, it has begun to illuminate the many ways our various structures, processes, rules, goals, and mindsets are self-reinforcing, and where efforts are counterbalancing. We're often getting in our own way. Overall, when it comes to any effort to change a system, people and organizations tend to focus their attention on the first leverage point: constants, parameters, and numbers. It is the leverage point that is most obvious and logical to people. However, it takes extraordinary effort, extraordinary resources for interventions focused on numbers to have impact in moving the system. We've actually seen this play out in architecture for years related to pipeline efforts. There's no question that pipeline efforts are crucial. To create a profession that reflects the demographics of the public the architecture community serves, we need to inspire and encourage young people to pursue a career in architecture. Efforts to support local NOMA project pipeline programs are vitally important in this way. But pipeline efforts aren't enough. The current members of the profession need to change themselves and the organizations they've built and that they sustain. We've already seen how true this is in the context of women in architecture. For years, the number of women graduating from schools of architecture has been around 50%, essentially mirroring the broader population. Yet career progress among women often stalls out, what is referred to as the missing 32%. There are other forces within the system that are counterbalancing. The fact that there is still very few women who hold the top positions in architecture firms, especially in lead design roles, speaks to aspects of the system that go beyond the pipeline of new entrants. Having very few women or people of color in top positions within architecture flows back and influences the numbers flowing into the system, dissuading demographically underrepresented young people from pursuing an architecture career. Many individuals and firms have put a great deal of time and money into youth engagement. Recently, firms are developing relationships with historically Black colleges and universities, wanting to strengthen recruitment efforts. But without also examining the rest of the system, the situation these young people are being recruited into, these recruitment efforts will fall flat. It's really a matter of integrity. If we're serious about recruiting people of all genders, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA people, people of all races and ethnicities to the profession of architecture, we need to be equally serious about ensuring firms operate in a way that people who have historically been marginalized have a strong chance to thrive. To create a profession that reflects and can best serve the public, we need strong pipeline efforts focused on the numbers flowing into the system. To create a culture where all can thrive, we need to focus interventions on the far side of the continuum. Things like who has access to what information, the actions and approaches that are encouraged and discouraged, who holds power in what situations, the goals of the system, and the mindsets that are foundational to the system. Mindsets are where we believe the work of culture change in the profession needs to focus, in tandem with and complementary to pipeline efforts. As those of you who have spent time focused on intercultural development or adaptive leadership know, self-awareness is core to growth and change. Self-awareness at both the individual level and the organizational level. This is about being honest with ourselves about the mindsets we hold, being curious about where those mindsets came from, how they were instilled, and how tightly or loosely we currently hold on to these mindsets. Our research sought to understand the mindsets currently held within the profession, both those that are dominant and those that are emergent. We developed a long list of these mindsets drawn from this research. These are mindsets that we identified profession-wide. Identifying and examining the mindsets you hold personally or that exist within your firm is the self-awareness work that we hope you'll choose to engage in. We went beyond identifying the mindsets currently held and also identified desired mindsets within the profession, those that on balance would be more likely to accelerate than to hinder creation of the desired culture that is authentic, equitable, and collaborative. In most cases, the mindsets needed to accelerate change already exist within the profession, but they are emergent, not dominant. To determine what mindsets already exist within a culture and to determine where culture change is happening, we need to be actively looking for patterns of behavior that demonstrate that are the manifestations of the mindsets we want to move away from or the mindsets we want to reinforce. This is pattern spotting. It can reveal where our self-awareness, individually and organizationally, is flawed or uninformed, or where our intent is not matching our impact. The mindsets document we'll be providing to you following this session brings forward the hindering and accelerating mindsets we identified in our research. Two examples of existing mindsets are shown on the left of this slide. One is a very prevalent mindset that long hours show dedication and are a badge of honor. We found this to be a mindset that hinders an authentic, equitable, and collaborative culture, and that a parallel mindset that is emergent will be more likely to accelerate change toward the culture we seek. The mindset that long hours are unhealthy and don't lead to quality work. Another very prevalent mindset is that architects can design a better world. We found this to be a mindset that on balance does not hinder the culture we seek, and that it is a mindset that should be reinforced and further leveraged in the context of culture change toward a mindset that the architecture community can design a better profession. In a few minutes, I'll come back to talking about mindsets. A complementary theory we dug into is complexity theory, which is about how we best implement interventions informed by our analysis of leverage points in the system. What leaders often want to do is simply direct that change happen, that new rules and policies be established, and that people be told to abandon past mindsets and adopt new ones. It's not quite as simple as that. The work of culture change is cultivation. It's about creating the conditions for change to take root and grow. While the desired change does need to be defined, getting there is an adaptive and iterative process where listening, observing, and responding are key. It's a lot like being a gardener. It involves seeding, nurturing, weeding, and harvesting. Seeding is about both people and ideas. It's about inspiring people to pursue architecture as a career and bringing new people and partners into a firm. It's also about seeding new thinking, new experiments. Nurturing takes a lot of different forms. Like soil, it's important to make sure the environment where seeds are planted is rich with nutrients, that it has been prepared with the supports and resources that people of various backgrounds and identities may need to thrive. Like rain or watering, culture change benefits from regular pauses, from regularly questioning assumptions and ways of doing things. Like sun, culture change can grow more rapidly when light is shown on those efforts that are having the desired impact. Culture change also benefits from efforts to create space, where initiatives and individuals with potential to exemplify the desired culture have more room to grow, and where individuals and efforts that are crowding out authenticity, equity, and collaboration are challenged and sometimes even removed, where individuals are held accountable for their impact on the culture. When we see efforts bear fruit, we have the opportunity to assess our outcomes, to compare our intentions to our impact. We can re-examine and rework our seeding, nurturing, and weeding approaches. It's important to recognize that this work is not linear in nature. Cultivation requires constant and simultaneous attention to seeding, nurturing, weeding, and harvesting. As we said early on in this presentation, culture is built every day by every one of us. This is true for culture change too. Culture change is everyone's work, no matter what position a person holds, how new or seasoned we are in the profession, the type of work we do. We have the opportunity to lead culture change. Think about your skills and what you get energy from doing. Think about the roles and responsibilities you hold, the people you currently work with, the opportunities you have to extend beyond your current roles and networks. Maybe you're someone who works well with young people, or you'd like to try. Maybe you're a creative, interdisciplinary thinker. You can lead through seeding. Maybe you're someone who is able to recognize differences and is practicing bridging or adapting toward difference. Maybe you have a knack for identifying underlying assumptions. Maybe you're someone who can tell the stories of progress. You can lead through nurturing. Maybe you hold a position with authority to determine where resources go within an organization, or you hold responsibilities related to alignment and accountability. You can lead through weeding and creating space for positive growth. Or maybe your skills are in analysis, or you tend to focus on outcomes more than process. Maybe you tend to encourage others to pause and celebrate the positive impacts their work has produced. You can lead in the work of harvesting. This is everyone's work. It cannot simply be the work of those in positions of leadership, or it will not take hold. Communities of practice are recommended as a way to support work like this, where people across an organization, across a profession or an industry, are working together to reinforce each other's learning and experimentation. AIA Minnesota has created a community of practice for culture change, and all within the architecture community who are committed to creating an authentic, equitable, collaborative culture are invited to join in. Over time, we hope and expect to expand this community of practice to include members of the broader AEC industry as well. The community of practice has begun its work with a focus on mindsets, pattern spotting to see where the mindsets show up in everyday experiences in the profession. We identified 3 pairs of mindsets for participants to choose from for their pattern spotting. This way, we are able to group people together to build off of each other's work. To give you a better idea of the mindsets participants are currently pattern spotting around, here are the pairs they could choose from. For the first pair, the hindering mindset is that individual achievement is primary, Pursuit of legacy is noble and individualistic in nature. The paired accelerating mindset is that collaboration is primary. Credit and legacy are team-based, and that team includes those involved in all aspects of the project. For the second pair, the hindering mindset is that people need to be both artistic and technically proficient to be a real architect and to be successful in the profession. And the accelerating mindset is that architects and designers can have strengths in various areas. We don't need to all be great at all aspects of the work of architecture to be successful. And for the third pair, the hindering mindset is one where people need to tamp down or hide the expression of their gender, culture, or sexual orientation in order to be successful. And the accelerating mindset is that the work of architecture is best accomplished when we can bring our whole selves to our work. We've asked members of the community of practice to document their observations around one of these pairs of mindsets. We've also asked them to map their observations to particular leverage points, which is informing their experiments with interventions in the system. Within the community of practice, we are sharing our learnings. We are keeping constant attention on this work, and we're working to practice what we preach, to operate with integrity in a manner that is authentic, equitable, and collaborative. This community of practice launched in January of 2021 and is primarily virtual in nature. There is an active group of nearly 100 people from across the nation who are participating. Eventually, this work may include an in-person component as well. So that's an overview of our culture change initiative. If you would like to sign up to participate in the community of practice for culture change, I encourage you to contact me or my colleague Paviel. Our emails are on the slide here. And I want to thank you again for your time and your attention. And I would love to answer any questions you may have. I'm going to stop sharing. All right. So, questions or thoughts? I welcome any questions you have about the research, about the community of practice, what we've learned as we've tried to apply these learnings. Have at it.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, cool. I'm Yin Wayne. Let me just put my face on. I guess I can't put my face on. So anyway, it's eye-opening, put on this way. And I just wonder how, and you probably hate me to ask this, is how do you show progress, right? Because this collaboration or this that show your real features rather than putting architects hats on, show real you. It's so ideal. However, how do you know you really are making where you're striving for?
So one thing that we just did within our own organization, and several of our member firms are taking these steps as well, is pursuing the JUST label. And as part of that, organizations are encouraged to conduct employee engagement and inclusion surveys. And so we developed a survey informed by a lot of our learnings and what we're working toward as a result of this culture change initiative. And so, you know, while we had sort of anecdotally understood that the culture of our own team within AIA Minnesota had changed dramatically over the course of the past several years in doing this work, we had never measured it. So it was really gratifying to see the results come back in ways that, again, through an anonymous survey, our scores related to engagement and inclusion were very high, much higher than any sort of industry averages that you see out there. And we very much attribute that to the work that we've done around intercultural development and this work around culture change, because we're trying to live what we are encouraging firms to do. So that's one way to measure progress. The other thing from a component perspective is we have really worked to grow the diversity and the cultural competence of our board of directors and the feeling of belonging within that group. And over the last few years, we've done this in a way that's one-to-one relationship building, not around EDI, but around what members of color are particularly interested in related to the profession. Our board right now is 34% people of color. And that, to put that in context, our membership is 4% people of color. And the reason that that's occurred is actually organically over time, engaging members of color in activities that they found interesting related to their practice areas or where they wanted to put their energy. And I think maybe one of the people on our board actually came up through our EDI committee's work. The vast majority of the diversity of our board is more organically grown in nature, and it's because we've created a culture of inclusion. So those are the indicators that may, be a step removed, but are indicators to us that we've made real change in the culture. I hope that's helpful.
All right, we have some questions in the Q&A. The first one was, what were some surprises found through the research?
The biggest one is what I alluded to in the presentation, that that the focus on the pipeline, while absolutely crucial, is the least impactful leverage point. I mean, I remember when we did that analysis, we had this big whiteboard and we were mapping our findings by leverage points. And there was like an audible gasp to realize that we were falling into the approach that most people do when they're attempting to shift a system, that they focus on the flows into the system. And what was both disheartening and inspiring about that was to say, it's disheartening to have so much of our effort focused on just one of those leverage points and be ignoring all of the others for so long. But there's so much opportunity to balance and make those pipeline efforts more impactful in the profession and for the people who are being recruited into this profession by changing all of these other aspects of how we operate. There's so much more potential than we are tapping right now in terms of creating change. And that idea that small changes can make a big difference when you're in that far end of that continuum. Small changes of mindset can flow through the rest of the system if cultivated. So that was a surprising finding in that way. The other findings around collaboration, architects and architectural designers talk about collaboration as so core. It's not just a talking point, it's something that people feel. It's their experience for the most part. but to have lack of collaboration and lack of listening skills pointed out by members of color in particular was really eye-opening for people. They thought that they were listening, but the fact that people of color weren't feeling heard meant that there's a gap there between intent and impact when it comes to the ability to truly listen.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. The next question we have is, I think you are saying that cultivating equity is top down, bottom up, and lateral in every sense. Considering this in your last slides, do you think challenges to changing hindering mindsets to accelerating mindsets are more generational than racial, demographic, or gender-based?
It's an interesting question. I think, as I've done this work over the years and with various professions, I should say my background with associations stretches back, 25 years, and I've worked on diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice for 20 plus of those years. And throughout that time, there has often been a repeated line and mindset that, well, the younger generation, they understand this better. They're going to lead us forward. We just need to defer to them. And the people who are the barriers to change are simply going to age out. And after 20 years, I don't believe that's true. I think that what is true is that the systems that have been built over time are pretty strong. They withstand a lot. And that's where, again, flows of new people with new ideas into a system is not enough to shift a system. So while we talk about it often in the context of the pipeline of women and people of color into the system, you can also think about it in terms of generations, younger people flowing into the system. If the system itself is not examined and reworked, those ideals, those skills, and that the types of knowledge that younger people are bringing into the profession gets tamped down, gets diffused, and people who get frustrated by that leave the profession to do something else and take those skills and those approaches with them, as opposed to applying it directly to the work of architecture. So while I am, very attuned to and grateful for the many young people who are leaders within our work here at AIA Minnesota related to racial justice, gender equity, and equity and inclusion more broadly, it's why we were also really careful to cultivate that culture change resource team to be across many generations and across positional power. And the results of that analysis and research were really of people working intergenerationally and having candid conversations with each other where they saw the world differently and saw the barriers to change differently.
Thank you. David has a question. Says, great and thoughtful presentation. As we find ourselves in a dispersed work environment, what challenge do you see in creating an engaging audience around this culture change?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I talk with young people in particular who have been onboarded during the pandemic. Amanda and I were just talking about that actually in her case, that she came on board during the pandemic. I will just say from my own experience, because I don't think there's really a lot of great research out there yet. We're still kind of in the midst of all of this. Following the murder of George Floyd, we leveraged the existing relationships that we had with MSP NOMA, our local NOMA chapter, to take action and to expand our efforts together. But in addition to that work, we became part of several entirely new coalitions that are focused on equity in the built environment. And it is possible to create trust, to develop a culture of candor within a team, and to, recognize and bridge across difference, all virtually. It wasn't until a couple of months ago that I met members of a couple of these coalitions in person for the first time. And so that's really in the formation of new teams and new efforts. When you're trying to shift where you're at as a culture, what can be in the context of remote work, when a lot of your experience has been in person, what I think is challenging is some of that pattern spotting, because you're working from, in many ways, memory of things past, as opposed to what you're experiencing in real time. That said, we launched our community of practice during the pandemic. It was launched in January of, no, sorry, it was not, it was launched in January of 2020, and it was launched virtually, but we just stayed virtual as opposed to getting folks together. And people have been able to do pattern spotting around the mindsets and to identify where the mindsets are showing up in relation to those leverage points, and are now developing interventions and experimenting with them, all within a virtual context. And what's great about this community practice model is that you can scale that just to your firm. You can take those same approaches and do that virtually as well. And we're happy to share, the kinds of questions that we've asked and the way that we've done this in the national community of practice in a way that you could implement with your firm. What's great about the community of practice is people share their experiments and where they got tripped up or where the outcome wasn't what they'd hoped for. And the other folks in that community of practice, empathize and also share their thoughts about next steps that can be taken to stick with that experiment in working that leverage point. So I think that pattern spotting, that organizational self-awareness work is something you can do right now in the context of the pandemic and will take you pretty far. In addition to that individual self-awareness work and intercultural competence development.
Thank you. And it seems like we will have time for maybe one more question. So from someone who's anonymous, how did you land on the particular theory selected given the number of theories available regarding organizational culture change?
Yes, we probably, oh man, I'm thinking back to how this office was covered in paper, a couple of years ago, as we had probably 12 different theories of change that we were exploring. And once I came across Danella Meadows' leverage points analysis, and we started to apply those learnings from the resource team's research to that construct, it lit up. It made sense. And the other thing that we thought was really compelling about that approach is that it dovetails so well with the ways that that people are trained to be architects. It's systems thinking. You all do this. So you inherently understand systems thinking. So being able to leverage that theoretical framework in this context seemed a great path to go. In terms of complexity theory, that was really in that space of accelerating change. And we did not find as many theories in that particular lane. And we were trying to figure out where do we go from here in concluding that research and moving it forward. And the idea of a community of practice that came from that complexity theory just seemed to fit really well with what we were able to do as an organization to keep this work moving forward.
All right, thank you. We are at our time limit. We have some people in the chat asking if a PDF is available of your presentation. We will have a recording of this presentation available on our website. And thank you, Mary Margaret.
My pleasure, truly. And I'm happy to share the PDF of the presentation and the mindset pairs as well. Okay.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.